Welcome back, listeners. This is the third and last part of Bristol murder. In the end of the second part, you heard that Peter got into the car and the car drove off fast down the street. And we left Jean and Susan watching a film in the theater. When they were watching film in the theater, they were sitting there. They were actually enjoying the film, although it was boring. Suddenly, the lights came on. It was the interval time. John turned towards Susan and said, "I'm very thirsty. Would you like a cola?" "Yes, please," she replied. John stood up. "Stay here," he said, "and I'll go and get you one." John walked to the end of the row of seats where they were sitting and up to the girl who was selling drinks and ice creams. "Tess, what do you want?" asked the girl with a smile. "Two colas, please," replied John. "There you are. That's £1.20, please," the girl said. John gave the money to the girl and started to walk back to Susan. Then he stopped. He could see that Susan was talking to another boy. She was arguing with him. The boy seemed very angry. John heard Susan say to the boy, "It's your own fault. You were late. Now go away and leave me alone." The boy didn't reply. He turned around and walked towards John. The boy bumped into John, knocking one of the bottles of cola on the ground. "Hey, what do you think you are doing?" said John angrily. "You had better leave my girl alone," answered the boy, "or I'll do more than just push you." John picked up the bottle from the floor and went back to Susan. "Who was that?" John asked Susan. "It was my boyfriend, Steve," Susan replied. "He's angry with me because I didn't wait for him outside the cinema." "What did your boyfriend say?" John asked as he passed Susan one of the bottles. Susan had a drink. "Steve told me to come and sit with him," she said. John nodded. "And what did you say?" he asked. "I told Steve to go away and leave me alone. I told Steve that I was a free person and didn't belong to him. I said he didn't own me and that I can do what I like. And anyway," she added, "I like you much more than him." John smiled. "I certainly like you much more than I like Steve," he said. Just then, the lights went out and the film started again, and they sat down and began to watch the film. Time passed very quickly for John and Susan, and soon the film finished and the lights came on. "Look," John said as they waited to leave the cinema. "I can't explain now, but I've got to go back to Bristol. If you give me your address, I'll write to you." When they got outside, Susan opened her bag, wrote down her address and gave it to John. While she was writing, John looked at his watch. It was 10:15, but he had promised to meet Peter at 10 o'clock. "I must go now, Susan," John said. "I'll write to you." "Goodbye," Susan said, "and take care of yourself." John walked quickly, thinking of Susan and the cinema. Suddenly a voice shouted, "Hey, you!" John stopped and turned around. It was Susan's boyfriend, Steve. "Where do you think you're going?" Steve said loudly. "It's nothing to do with you," replied John, and carried on walking. "Oh, yeah, it is," shouted Steve. John could hear feet running up behind him. He didn't turn around. Suddenly, John felt a kick on the back of the leg. He tried to run, but fell over instead. He lay on the ground, and as he looked up, he saw that Steve was standing over him. "Now we'll have a little talk," said Steve. "No, we won't," said John, jumping up and pushing Steve away. Then John looked around. Steve wasn't alone. He had 3 friends with him. Steve came up to John and pushed him against the wall. "So," he said, "you want to fight, do you?" As he said each word, he pushed John hard against the wall with his hand. John felt lost. What could he do? There were 4 people against him, and he was in a strange town. "We are going to teach you a lesson," said Steve, with a nasty laugh. "We are going to teach you not to try to steal my girlfriend." John began to feel afraid. He knew that he must do something quickly. Suddenly he hit Steve in the stomach and tried to run away, but the other 3 boys got him. "So you are frightened, are you?" asked one of the boys. "You can't get away now," said another. "We are going to teach you a lesson," said the third. Then one of the boys hit John hard in the face, and another boy hit him in the stomach. John fell on the ground. He felt sick. Then Steve came up and started to kick him. John was going to scream when he suddenly heard a voice which he recognized. "Leave him alone," said the boys. It was Peter. "Leave him alone," Peter shouted. Steve stopped kicking John and turned around. "Who are you?" Steve asked. "And what do you want?" "Go away and mind your own business." "No, I won't mind my business," said Peter, and hit Steve hard, knocking him against the wall. John, seeing that the others were watching Steve and Peter fight, jumped up and started to run. "This way," shouted Peter. "Get into the car." John ran over to the big black car which was standing by the pavement. As John got in, he looked back to see that Peter had beaten Steve. Steve and his friends were running away. "How did you know I was here?" John asked Peter when he got into the car. "Well, talk about it later," said Peter. John and Peter sat in silence until the car stopped beside Peter's lorry. Peter thanked the driver, and both Peter and John got into the lorry. Peter started the engine and they drove back to Bristol. "Now," said Peter, as they were leaving Manchester, "tell me how you got into the fight." John explained to Peter about the cinema and Susan and Steve and everything. "I hope that fight taught you a lesson," said Peter. "John?" "Yeah, I know," replied John with a laugh. "Don't steal other boys' girlfriends. You sound just like Steve." "But how? How did you know where I was? You arrived just in time." "I didn't know where you were," replied Peter. "It was just luck. I was in the car on the way back to Lorry when I saw the fight. I asked the driver to stop because it didn't seem to be a fair fight. It was 4 against 1. I didn't recognize you until after I had shouted stop." "That was lucky," said John. "Yeah," laughed Peter, "but next time be careful. Next time you get into a fight, I may not be there to rescue you." "All right," answered John, "but what happened when you went to see your friends? Were they able to help us?" Peter told John about his visit to the cafe, the meeting with the man with the knife, and the talk with Jeff at the cabaret club. When can we go? When can we go and see this man in Bristol?" "The one Jeff told you about?" asked John. It depends. It depends on when we can get back to Bristol," said Peter. "What's the time?" "It's 11 o'clock," John replied. "Well," said Peter, "we should arrive in Bristol about 5 o'clock in the morning. If we have some sleep after we arrive, we could go and see Bob Steele before lunch." "Won't you have to work tomorrow?" inquired John. Peter shook his head. "No," he said. "Universal Transport don't expect me to drive back until tomorrow, so I need not go back tomorrow. We'll have all day tomorrow to find the murderer." It was warm in the lorry. John was tired after the day's excitement, so he soon went to sleep. Peter drove on and on and on through the night. Halfway to Bristol, they stopped at a cafe and had coffee and some sandwiches. Then they drove on again. The big lorry was empty and so went faster than usual. There were no cars and only a few lorries on the road. They drove faster than Peter had expected, and it was still dark when they arrived in Bristol. "Wake up!" shouted Peter. "We are in Bristol now." John looked out of the window sleepily. Peter stopped the lorry. You had better come to Bridgewater with me, he said. It may not be safe for you to stay in Bristol. No, don't be stupid, replied John. I can look after myself. All right, said Peter with a smile. Do you want to get out here? See you at lunchtime, said John as he got out of the lorry. But before Peter had time to reply, John jumped back into the lorry. Perhaps you're right, John said. I'll come to Brightwater with you. Why did you change your mind so suddenly? Asked Peter. Because I saw two policemen walking up as I was getting out of the lorry, answered Peter. John stayed with Peter in Brightwater after their tiring night. They both slept well. Peter's mother was surprised to see John, but Peter explained that he was a friend in trouble. He didn't explain what the trouble was. Soon after 12 o'clock the next day, they drove back into Bristol. Peter stopped the lorry outside a house close to the river. I think this is it, he said. He took out the piece of paper which Jeff had given him and looked at the address. Bob Steele, 12 River Street. Yeah, that's right. Number 12 River Street was a small, low house which hadn't been painted for a long time. The windows were dirty and the curtains were drawn. The house looked empty. Peter knocked at the door. There was no answer. Peter knocked again. I'm coming, shouted a voice after a couple of minutes. The door opened a few centimeters. Who is it? A voice asked. We want to talk to Bob Steele, Peter replied. Why? Asked the voice. We want some information, answered Peter. Come in then, the voice said. You've come to the right place if you want information. Come in, said the man at the door. He was Bob Steele. John and Peter went into the hall. It was dark and they couldn't see very much. Bob Steele went ahead of them up the stairs. It smells bad here, doesn't it? John whispered to Peter. Peter nodded and they followed Bob Steele up the stairs and into a small room at the back of the house. Although it was the middle of the day, the curtains were drawn in this room too. The only light came from a small lamp on the table by the bed. The bed was untidy and the sheets were very dirty. The floor of the room was covered in old newspapers. Sit down, said Bob Steele. Peter and John sat down and were able to look at Bob Steele in the light for the first time. He was middle-aged and quite short. His hair was red and he had a small red beard. He was wearing old clothes but had a big new gold watch on his wrist. I'm Bob Steele, the man said. If you want information, you've come to the right person. We want some information about a murderer, said Peter quietly. Murderer? Replied Bob Steele. Which murderer? It was my... said John quickly. Wait a minute, Peter said to John. Let me do the talking. Then Peter turned back to Bob Steele. We want some information about the murder of a teacher called Stevens. He was killed the night before last. Yes, said Bob Steele, and then stopped. He looked closely at John. I've seen your photograph in the newspaper. Ain't you the boy the police are looking for? Bob Steele asked. Listen, Peter interrupted. We came here to ask questions, not to answer them. Okay, replied Bob Steele. If you give me a couple of hours, I can find out all you want to know. All I've heard about the murderer so far is that Mr. Stevens wasn't killed for money. There must have been some other reason. That's not much help, said Peter. Look, said Bob Steele, I can find out a lot more, but you must give me a little time. Come back after lunch and bring the money. What money? Exclaimed Peter. Jeff Beck told us you would help us because you were a friend of his. Jeff was right, replied Bob Steele. I will help you, but I want £100 for helping you. £100. Peter stood up. We'll come back at 12 o'clock, he said. Come on, John, let's go. Peter and John left the house and walked down the street. They stopped at a cafe on the corner and went in. I don't know, said John after they had sat down. Bob Steele wasn't much help, was he? Let's wait and see, said Peter. But Peter, replied John, I haven't got £100 to give to Bob Steele. Neither have I, said Peter. I've only got £20 on me. John laughed. I hope that's enough, he said. It will have to be enough, said Peter. But do you trust Bob Steele? Asked John. Do you believe that he will tell us the truth? We don't have any choice, said Peter slowly. We must trust him because he is the only person who can help us. Peter and John had lunch at the cafe and afterwards went back to River Street. Bob Steele was waiting for them. He took them upstairs to the same room. Right, said Bob Steele, when they had sat down. Have you got the money? Peter nodded. Have you got the information? He asked. Bob Steele smiled. I'll tell you what I've heard. Mr. Stevens wasn't killed for money. He was killed by someone who knew him. He was killed by someone young. John went red in the face and stood up. What do you mean by that? He shouted. Be quiet, said Peter, and let Bob Steele finish. John sat down and stared at Bob Steele. He was killed by someone young, Bob Steele repeated. He was killed by a boy who knew him. Is that all? Asked Peter. Yes, replied Bob Steele. Now give me the money. Wait a minute, said Peter firmly. I'll give you the money when you tell me the name of the murderer. Give me the money now, said Bob Steele loudly. Don't give him anything, shouted John. He's a liar. He's not telling the truth. He wants you to think that I am the murderer. Bob Steele turned and went up to John angrily. Listen, my boy, he said. You'd better keep quiet unless you want the police to know where you are. You can't frighten me, replied John. Bob Steele turned back to Peter. Now give me the money and get out, he said. I tell you what I'll do, said Peter quietly. I'll give you £20 now, and I'll give you the rest when you tell me the name of the murderer. Bob Steele was quiet for a minute. He looked at John and thought for a moment. He took the money. Then he smiled. Okay, said Bob Steele. Let's arrange a place to meet. How about under the clock at the railway station at 3:30? I'll be able to tell you the name then. We'll see you then, said Peter. Peter and John went out together. When they were in the street, Peter turned angrily to John. Why don't you keep quiet? Peter said, turning to John. Bob Steele is our only chance. You shouldn't shout at him or call him a liar. I don't like him, replied John. And anyway, he was trying to make you think that I am the murderer. We'll find out who is the murderer at 3:30, said Peter, and they walked off the street. Bob Steele watched John and Peter from his window. He waited until they had gone. Then he went downstairs and over to the public telephone box across the street. He dialed a number. Hello, he said. Is that the police? Now, listeners, for a while, let's leave Bob Steele on the phone and we go with John and Peter and let's listen him what they are talking and what they are doing. I must go to the post office, said Peter as he and John walked away from Bob Steele's house. Why? Asked John. I must get the £80 to pay Bob Steele, replied Peter. I see, said John. But do you think Bob Steele will meet us at the station at 3:30? I expect he will, said Peter, unless you made him too angry. Do you want to come to the post office with me? No, thanks, answered John. I can look after myself. I'll go straight to the railway station and meet you there. All right, said Peter. Do as you like. See you at the station at 3:30. See you then, said John. Then John walked off down the road towards the river. He watched the ships unloading for a while. Then he walked back up the hill towards the station. He went into the station and sat on a seat. There were lots of people in the station and no one noticed him. He watched the trains come and go. The time passed quickly. Then looking at the station clock, John saw to his surprise that it was already 3:30. He couldn't see either Peter or Bob Steele. John got up and walked over to the clock. 5 minutes passed. He began to wonder what had happened. Suddenly, 2 men walked up to him. I wonder what they want, thought John. Perhaps they want to ask the way. John Stevens, the first man said. I'm Detective Inspector Shaw. You are under arrest for the murder of your uncle. They were policemen. John looked around to see if he could escape, but the second policeman put his hand on John's shoulder. "Don't try to run away," said the policeman. "You'd better come with us." The policeman took John outside the railway station where there was a police car waiting. They put John into the back seat and Detective Inspector Shaw got in beside him. The other policeman got into the driving seat and started the car. As they were driving off, John looked back at the station and saw Peter looking at the car. "Why did he do that?" asked Detective Inspector Shaw. "Do what?" replied John. "Kill your uncle," said Inspector Shaw. "I didn't kill my uncle," John said angrily. "Oh yeah, you did," said Inspector Shaw, looking closely at John. "We know you did." John didn't reply. When the police car arrived at the police station, the policeman took John inside. They put him in a small room with no window and told him to wait there. There was no chair, and John was soon tired of standing, so he sat down on the floor. A few minutes later, Inspector Shaw came in. He saw John sitting on the floor and told him to stand up. John stood up. "Are you going to tell us all about the murder now?" asked Inspector Shaw roughly. John didn't reply. He looked at the floor. "Look at me, boy," shouted the policeman. John looked up. "Now tell me the truth," said Inspector Shaw. "Tell me why you killed your uncle." "I didn't," started John. "I see," interrupted Inspector Shaw. "So you want to be difficult, yeah?" Inspector Shaw went out of the room and banged the door. John sat down again. But as soon as he did so, the door opened and he was told to stand up. About an hour, another policeman came in, smiled, and said hello to John. "I'm Sergeant Blake," he said. "Are you John?" "Yes," John replied. Sergeant Blake brought 2 chairs. He and John sat down. "I expect you are thirsty," said Sergeant Blake. "Would you like a cup of tea?" "Yes, please," said John with a smile. He liked this policeman and much more than Inspector Shaw. Sergeant Blake brought in 2 cups of tea and a plate of cakes. "Now then," said Sergeant Blake kindly, "what's all this about?" John didn't reply. "You can trust me," said Sergeant Blake. "I'll understand." John liked Sergeant Blake, and he liked the tea, so he started to answer the sergeant's questions. "Did you like your uncle?" asked the sergeant. "No," said John slowly. "Not very much." "Where have you been for the last 2 days?" asked Sergeant Blake. "I've been to..." John stopped. Just then there was a knock at the door. Sergeant Blake got up and went out. John sat and thought for a minute. "I must be more careful," he thought. "I nearly said that I had been to Manchester. That would get Peter into trouble for helping me." Sergeant Blake still hadn't come back, but John could hear his voice. He went up to the floor and listened. Sergeant Blake was talking to Inspector Shaw. "He's starting to talk now," said Sergeant Blake. "Good," replied Inspector Shaw. "He'll tell you everything now." John went back to his chair and sat down. That was lucky, he thought. It had all been a trick to make him talk. Sergeant Blake and Inspector Shaw were working together. Sergeant Blake came back into the room. "Now," he said with a smile, "where were we?" "Oh yes, you were just telling me that you had been to..." "I do not remember now. Where was it you said you had been?" "I haven't been anywhere," said John, "and I'm not telling you anything." "Now, don't be stupid," said Sergeant Blake. "If you didn't kill your uncle, you haven't got anything to be afraid of, have you? Tell me all about it, and I'll see if I can help you." John said nothing. Sergeant Blake tried asking more questions, but John didn't reply. After a while, the sergeant put John in another room with a bed and locked the door. "Can I have some food, please?" John asked. "Yes," the policeman replied. "You can have some food when you've told us the truth." Let's leave John in the cell here and we move on with Peter. What Peter is doing. Peter looked at the police car as it drove away from the railway station. He thought that he could see John inside the car. Peter looked again. Yes, it was John. The police had caught John at the railway station. Peter ran into the station and looked under the clock, but there was no one there. But where was Bob Steele? Perhaps Bob Steele had already left, or perhaps he had seen the police and run away. Or perhaps Bob Steele had told the police that John would be waiting at the station at 3:30. Peter turned around angrily and left the station. Peter went back to River Street to collect his lorry. He also wanted to talk to Bob Steele again. He wanted to find out if Bob Steele had told the police about John and if he knew anything more about the murder. When Peter arrived at River Street, he was still feeling very angry. Peter banged on the front door of Bob's home, but there was no answer. He waited for a moment and then banged again. There was still no answer. Peter tried to look in front window, but he couldn't see anything because the curtains were all closed. He went around to the back of the house and banged on the back door. There was no answer. Right, thought Peter. If Bob Steele is at home, he'll have to go out at some time. If he's out, he'll return home in the end. So I'll wait for him. Peter walked back to the front door of the house and drove his lorry around the corner, out of sight. Then Peter went into the cafe on the corner where he and John waited. It was just after 4 o'clock. Peter drank a cup of tea and waited. By 5 o'clock, Bob Steele still had not appeared. Peter drank another cup of tea and ate some biscuits. At 6 o'clock, he went out, bought a newspaper and returned to the cafe. He looked at the front page of the newspaper. Youth arrested for murder. Police are still trying to find the murderer of 44-year-old schoolmaster Robert Stevens this afternoon. The police said that Mr. Stevens' nephew John was helping them with their inquiries. Peter pushed the newspaper away angrily, so it was true. John was under arrest. Peter asked for another cup of tea. At 6:30, he decided not to wait for Bob Steele any longer. He was just leaving the cafe when he suddenly stopped. He could see Bob Steele walking quickly along the street away from number 12. Peter decided to follow him. Bob Steele went towards the center of the town and Peter followed him. When Bob Steele stopped to cross the road, Peter hid in a doorway. When Bob Steele looked around, Peter hid behind the newspaper. After a few minutes, Bob Steele stopped at the bus stop. Peter waited in a shop doorway, pretending to read his newspaper. The bus came and Bob Steele got on. Peter followed and sat close to the door of the bus so that he could watch Bob Steele without being seen. Peter wasn't sure that what ticket he should buy, so he asked to go to the center of town and hoped that Bob Steele would get off there. Peter was right. Bob Steele got off at the bus station in the center of the town. Here, it was easier for Peter to follow because there were more people. Soon Bob Steele turned into a narrow side street. Peter followed him, but when Peter turned the corner, he was surprised to see that the side street was empty. Peter walked along the side street slowly and carefully, stopping every few minutes to listen. Halfway down the street, he could hear voices coming from a dark shop doorway. He went close to the doorway and listened. Peter could hear Bob Steele's voice, but couldn't hear all the words. Peter could only hear some of the words. Bob Steele was saying, "Told you, trust me, the police arrest, railway station." Peter moved closer to try to hear what Bob Steele was saying. Suddenly, Peter bumped into a tin which was lying on the ground. The tin made a loud noise. Bob Steele and the person he was with stopped talking. Peter jumped back and tried to hide, but it was too late. "There is someone there," shouted Bob Steele, and he and the person he was talking to ran off down the street. Peter ran after them. He could see both of them clearly as they ran ahead of him. The person Bob Steele had been talking to looked quite young, about 15 or 16 years old. At the end of the street, Bob Steele turned to the right, and the boy he had been talking to turned to the left. "What shall I do?" thought Peter. "Which one should I follow?" He decided to run after Bob Steele. He ran as fast as he could and slowly got closer and closer to Bob Steele. Bob Steele looked over his shoulder at Peter and tried to run faster, but Peter caught up with him and took hold of his coat. Bob Steele tried to get free, but he couldn't escape. Peter caught hold of Bob Steele's arm and twisted it behind his back. "Now," said Peter, "you're going to tell me the truth." "Come on," said Peter, "tell me the truth." But Bob Steele didn't say anything, so Peter twisted his arm a bit more. "Ow!" cried Bob Steele. "Stop it!" "I'll stop it when you start talking," replied Peter. "All right," said Bob Steele, "but I can't talk here. Let's go back to my house and I'll tell you there." "I've got a better idea," said Peter. "We'll walk back to your house and you can tell me what you know as we walk." "Okay," said Bob Steele, "but please leave go of my arm." Peter laughed. "No," he said, "I don't want you to run away again." Then they started walking back to River Street. "Now," said Peter, "did you send the police to the railway station?" Bob Steele shook his head. "No," he said, "I didn't do that." Peter twisted Bob's arm. "I don't believe you," he said. "Why did you send the police to the station? Was it for money?" "No," said Bob Steele. "They didn't give me very much." Then he was silent. "Very much? What?" asked Peter quickly. "They didn't give you very much what? Very much money? So you did tell the police that John was at the station, but they didn't pay you very much? Very well." Bob Steele didn't reply. They both walked in silence for a moment. "Who were you talking to?" asked Peter. "When?" said Bob Steele. "When I caught you," replied Peter. "I was talking to myself," said Bob Steele. "No, you won," Peter said firmly. "I saw you talking to a boy. Who was he?" Bob Steele didn't answer. They walked in a silence again and very soon back outside number 12 River Street again. "Open the door," Peter told Bob. "We haven't finished our conversation yet." When they were sitting in the upstairs room again, Peter leaned forward and started to speak seriously to Bob Steele. "Now, let's be honest with each other. You make your living by selling information. You sold information about my friend John to the police." Bob Steele opened his mouth to speak, but Peter ignored him and continued. "You sold John to the police," said Peter, "but the police didn't pay you very much, so someone else must have paid you as well. Someone else must have given you money to tell the police where John was. Am I right?" Bob Steele looked at the floor and didn't reply. Peter went on. "I think that the person who paid you to tell the police where John was must have had a reason. I think he must have had a good reason to want to see John arrested by the police. Do you know what reason?" Bob Steele shook his head. "No, I don't." "Well, I do," said Peter. "I think the person who paid you money to get John arrested was the murderer." "Now tell me the name of the person who paid you. Tell me his name." Bob Steele looked up. "You don't understand, mister," he said. "I don't tell people things. I sell information. If you want to know anything more, you will have to pay me." Peter raised his hand angrily to hit Bob Steele. "Don't hit me," Bob Steele shouted. "If you hit me, I won't tell you anything." Peter lowered his hand and smiled. "You would sell your own mother if you could," he said. "All right, I'll pay you. How much do you want?" "You promised me 80 pounds, said Bob Steele quickly. "That's right," answered Peter, and took out the money. He held the money out to Bob Steele. "Here you are," Peter continued. Tell me the name of the person who paid you to get John arrested. Bob Steele took the money and counted it. Then he put it in a pocket of his old coat. Well, he said, I'm afraid I can't tell you the name. What? Shouted Peter angrily. Wait a moment, let me explain, said Bob Steele. I can't tell you the name because I don't know it, but I can tell you two things. What are they? Asked Peter. Firstly, said Bob Steele slowly, that everything I told you this afternoon was true. Tell me what you said this afternoon again, said Peter. Very well, said Bob Steele. I told you that Mr. Stevens wasn't killed for money. He was killed by someone who knew him. He was killed by someone young. What's the second thing you have to tell me? Peter asked. Just this, replied Bob Steele. If you go to Manor Park Secondary School, you will find the answer to all your questions. How will I find the murderer at Manor Park Secondary School? Asked Peter in surprise. Mr. Stevens was a teacher there, answered Bob Steele. Peter stood up quickly. I'm going to go there now, he said, but I may have some more questions to ask you, especially if I find that you haven't been telling me the truth. I think I'll tie you up to make sure that you don't go out while I'm away. Peter picked up a piece of rope which was lying on the floor. He tied Bob Steele to the chair in which he was sitting. Then Peter ran down the stairs and out of the house, leaving the front door partly open. Manor Park Secondary School was on the other side of Bristol. It was lucky that the lorry was around the corner. Peter got into the lorry and drove off to the school very fast. Peter stopped the lorry outside Manor Park Secondary School. Then he looked at his watch. It was already 8 o'clock. The school looked dark and closed. Peter got out of the lorry and then he noticed that there was a light in one of the rooms. Peter went over to the window and looked in. There was a man of about 60 cleaning the floor of the classroom. Peter knocked at the window and the man looked up. The man saw Peter and opened the window. What do you want? The man asked. I'd like to have a talk with you, Peter replied. I'm very busy at the moment, the man said. It's about Mr. Stevens, Peter said. Oh, replied the man, you'd better come in and then we can have a talk. The man was the school caretaker. He cleaned the rooms and took care of the building. The caretaker let Peter in and they sat down in the caretaker's room together. What do you want to know about Mr. Stevens? Asked the caretaker carefully. Are you from the newspapers? Peter shook his head. No, he said. And I'm not from the police either. I'm a friend of Mr. Stevens' nephew, John. Ah, yes, said the caretaker. John has been arrested by the police. Peter nodded. That's right, he said. But I think the police are wrong. I don't think that John killed his uncle. Did you know Mr. Stevens well? Yes, replied the caretaker as he lit a cigarette. I've been working here for nearly 20 years and Mr. Stevens had been here for 10 years. What was Mr. Stevens like? Asked Peter. The caretaker thought for a moment before saying anything. He was always very pleasant to me, the caretaker continued, but his pupils means students, but his pupils did not like him. Why not? Asked Peter. Mr. Stevens lost his temper very quickly, said the caretaker. He got angry very easily. He had fixed ideas about his pupils. Once he got the idea that a particular pupil was bad, he would never change his opinion. Did Mr. Stevens ever hit his pupils? Asked Peter. I think so, replied the caretaker, but it would be better for you to ask some of the boys themselves. Where can I find them, some of them now? Asked Peter. A lot of the boys go to a cafe about 1 kilometer from here, close to the Scala Cinema, the caretaker replied. If you go there, you'll find some of Mr. Stevens' pupils. Peter thanked the caretaker. He left the school and drove down to the cafe which the caretaker had told him about. The cafe was dark inside and the radio was playing very loudly. A crowd of boys and girls aged 15 or 16 were standing by the door. Peter went up to them, said hello, and then asked them if they knew Mr. Stevens. Stevens, said one of the boys. I'm glad he's dead. He was terrible. Why was he terrible? Asked Peter. Mr. Stevens used to make us look stupid. He used to make jokes about our clothes and say how stupid we were all the time, the boy explained. My father is in prison, said another boy, and Mr. Stevens used to make jokes about it in every lesson. He used to ask me if I was going to be a thief like my father. Stevens used to hit us too, said another boy. Why? Asked Peter. He used to hit us all the time, the boy replied. He hit us if we were late or if we didn't answer his questions correctly. What was Mr. Stevens like in school on the day he was killed? Peter asked the group of the boys. It's funny you should ask that, said one of the boys, because he had a big argument in our class that day. What was the argument about? Inquired Peter. I don't remember now, said the boy. I think it was because Mr. Stevens said that a boy who had been rude to him. The boy said he hadn't, but Mr. Stevens shouted at him and gave him a lot of extra homework to do. What was the name of the boy? Asked Peter. I think it was Tommy Logan. Tommy Logan? Said another boy. Yes, Tommy Logan. Peter thanked the boys and asked them where he could find Tommy Logan. Tommy could be anywhere, one of them said. He has got a motorbike, but he usually comes here to the cafe at about 9 o'clock, so if you wait here, you'll probably see him. Peter went into the cafe, got a cup of coffee, and sat down. He had been waiting for nearly half an hour when he heard a motorbike arrive outside. A dark-haired boy wearing a leather jacket pushed through the crowd at the door. The boy came up to Peter. I hear that you are asking questions about me, he said, staring at Peter. What do you want? Peter looked at the boy in the leather jacket. Peter couldn't remember where he had seen him before. Then Peter remembered that was the boy he had been talking to, Bob Steele. Peter looked carefully at the boy in the leather jacket. Sit down, Peter said. Are you Tommy Logan? That's right, replied the boy. He was about 16, with dark hair and a thin face. He seemed nervous and his eyes were moving all the time. I want to ask you some questions about Mr. Stevens, Peter told the boy calmly. Are you from the police? Asked Tommy Logan. Peter shook his head. No, I'm not, he said. In that case, replied the boy, I don't have to talk to you. Goodbye. The boy stood up and turned to go. Peter caught hold of the sleeve of the boy's leather jacket. Don't go yet, Peter said quietly. Let's talk about your friend Bob Steele. A look of fear came into Tommy Logan's eyes. He pulled his jacket out of Peter's hand and pushed his way to the door. Peter got up and ran after the boy. When Peter got to the door, he was just in time to see Tommy Logan jump on his motorbike. Peter ran out to the pavement, but it was too late. Tommy Logan started the engine and drove off. I know where he's going, Peter said to himself. He ran back to his lorry and jumped in. He started the engine quickly and drove after the motorbike, but the motorbike was faster than the lorry and soon disappeared. Never mind, said Peter to himself. I know where he's going. Peter drove back to River Street as fast as he could. As he turned the corner into the River Street, he switched off the lorry's lights. Peter drove slowly and quietly along the street and stopped close to number 12, outside Bob Steele's house. Peter could see a motorbike. It was Tommy Logan's motorbike. Peter had been right in thinking that the boy would come here. Peter climbed over the wall into the garden and went up to the front door. It was wide open. Inside, Peter could hear voices. He started to climb the stairs. Just then, the door of Bob Steele's room opened and someone switched on the light. There he is, on the stairs, shouted Tommy Logan, pointed at Peter. Before Peter could hide, Bob Steele and Tommy Logan came running out of the room. Peter got ready to stop them as they came down the stairs. Suddenly, Peter saw that Bob Steele was carrying a chair. It was the chair Peter had tied Bob Steele up in. Tommy Logan must have untied him with a laugh. Bob Steele threw the chair at Peter from the top of the stairs. The chair was heavy. It hit Peter on the shoulder and knocked him down the stairs. Then Tommy Logan and Bob Steele ran down the stairs, jumped over Peter's body, and ran out into the street. Peter lay at the bottom of the stairs. His head and right shoulder hurt badly. Then he heard the motorbike starting. With difficulty, Peter got up and went to the door. Bob Steele and Tommy Logan were both on the motorbike and they were driving away fast down the street. "I'm not going to lose them again," said Peter aloud. He forgot about the pain in his shoulder and ran as fast as he could to his lorry. In a moment, he was chasing after the motorbike in his lorry. The motorbike turned right at the end of the street and went down the hill towards the river. Peter switched on the lorry's headlights fully, and with the tires screaming, he followed the motorbike around the corner. Going down the hill, Peter was able to go faster than the motorbike and was soon only 50 meters behind them. Then, at the bottom of the hill, the motorbike suddenly turned right into a narrow street. Peter followed the motorbike into the narrow street. As the lorry's light lit up at the wall at the end of the street, Peter shouted happily. "Now I've got you," he shouted. "There is no way out." The street had no exit. The only way out of the street was back to the road. The motorbike went to the end of the street and, discovering that there was no way out, turned around. Then the motorbike drove back towards Peter. Peter could see Tommy Logan's face as he drove the motorbike straight at the lorry. Peter quickly turned the lorry across the street so that the motorbike could not pass, and then he waited for the crash. With a roar, the motorbike came right up to the lorry. Then Tommy Logan saw a narrow gap between the lorry and the wall. The gap was less than a meter wide, but big enough to let the motorbike escape. The motorbike roared through the gap between the lorry and the wall. Peter was furious. Angrily, he turned the lorry around and began to chase the motorbike. When he turned into the road by the river, Peter could just see the backlight of the motorbike disappearing in the distance. He drove faster. He turned a corner, and then, to his surprise, Peter saw Tommy Logan and Bob Steele had been delayed. They had stopped in a queue of cars at the traffic lights. The lights were red, and so the cars had to wait. Tommy Logan looked over his shoulder and saw that Peter's lorry was approaching fast. Peter was now very close. Tommy Logan decided that he would not wait at the red lights. Suddenly, he drove his motorbike out into the middle of the road and passed all the cars waiting at the traffic lights. Then, without stopping, the motorbike went straight across the crossroad against the red lights and nearly crashed into a car coming the other way. Peter immediately followed the motorbike and passed the line of cars which was waiting. He didn't wait for the traffic lights to turn green. He drove faster and chased Tommy Logan and Bob Steele across the crossroads and then down the street. They were getting nearer the center of town now, and the roads were busier. As Peter passed car after car in his chase after the two men, he looked in the lorry's mirror. In the mirror, Peter could see a police car with its lights flashing, chasing both the lorry and the motorbike. "Well," thought Peter, "I'm not going to stop now. I'll catch that motorbike if it's the last thing I do." With the tires screaming and smoking as they went around the corner, Peter drove his lorry as fast as he could after the motorbike, and behind both the lorry and the motorbike came the police car with its flashing lights. At 100 kilometers an hour, the motorbike carrying Tommy Logan and Bob Steele roared through the center of Bristol. Peter's big lorry raced after them. Behind Peter came a police car with its blue light flashing. Tommy Logan looked quickly over his shoulder to see if Peter was any closer. Peter was much closer. Tommy Logan looked ahead again and saw a sign, "Slow, bridge ahead." With a smile, Tommy drove the motorbike under the bridge. Peter saw the bridge coming, but the lorry was going too fast to stop. The lorry was quite high, and Peter thought it would hit the top of the bridge and crash. With a loud roar, the lorry went under the bridge and missed the top by a few centimeters. Peter wiped the sweat from his forehead. That was close, Peter said to himself. Peter looked in the mirror again. There were now two police cars behind him. He could see their blue lights flashing, but he decided he wouldn't stop. He had to drive on. Slowly but surely, Peter got closer and closer to the motorbike. Soon he was next to it. The motorbike and the lorry screamed down the street side by side. A car coming in the opposite direction saw the lorry and motorbike and drove up onto the pavement to avoid a crash. Finally, Peter got a little in front of the motorbike and slowed down to make it stop. Tommy Logan also slowed down. Then he suddenly drove the motorbike up onto the pavement and passed Peter again. The people on the pavement jumped for their lives when they saw the motorbike coming towards them. Bob Steele's face was white with fear as he held onto Tommy Logan's back. Tommy drove the bike onto the road again. He was now 50 meters ahead of Peter. The road was straight now for nearly a kilometer. The two police cars behind the lorry were now much closer. Peter saw the flashing lights of another police car in front of them. Tommy Logan saw the police car coming too and started to slow down. A moment later, Tommy turned the motorbike around and came roaring back towards Peter. Peter stopped the lorry in the middle of the road. The two police cars behind the lorry screamed to a stop, one on each side of the lorry. Now, there was no escape for the motorbike to pass. Peter jumped out of his lorry and started running towards the motorbike. Tommy Logan drove the motorbike straight at Peter, but at the last moment, Peter jumped aside. The motorbike crashed into the lorry. Peter stood still in the middle of the road for a second. He watched the motorbike hit the back wheel of his lorry. Behind him, he could hear the policemen getting out of their cars and running towards him and the motorbike. In front of him, another policeman pointed at him and shouted, "Stop!" Tommy Logan was not hurt. He jumped up immediately and started to run away. Peter chased after him. As he ran, Peter quickly looked behind him. Bob Steele was lying on the ground by the motorbike with a policeman standing over him. Two other policemen were chasing Peter. Peter could run faster than Tommy Logan. He got closer and finally jumped and caught Tommy Logan by the shoulders. They both fell to the ground with Peter holding on Tommy's coat. Then Peter felt two strong hands pulling him away. He looked up and saw two policemen. "All right, you two, stop fighting. You're both under arrest," said one of the policemen. Peter and Tommy both stood up and looked at each other. "Now, come with us," said the policeman, who was now firmly holding Tommy's arm, and the four of them walked back to the police car. Another policeman was waiting for them with Bob Steele. Bob Steele had some blood on his face, but he looked more frightened than hurt. The motorbike was put in the back of Peter's lorry, and a policeman drove it back to the police station. Peter, Tommy Logan, and Bob Steele followed in the police cars. When they arrived at the police station, they were taken to see the sergeant. The sergeant took their names and address. Now then, he said, "What's all this about?" Bob Steele and Tommy Logan said nothing. Peter thought for a minute and then he spoke. "It's about the murder of Mr. Stevens." "Really?" said the sergeant. "You were driving through Bristol at 100 kilometers an hour because Mr. Stevens was murdered, were you?" Peter tried to explain the situation, but the sergeant didn't want to listen. "If it's about the murder," the sergeant said, "you can talk to the inspector. He is out now, but he'll be back in half an hour. I hope you're telling the truth, because the inspector is a very busy man. He'll be very angry if he thinks you are wasting his time." "He's mad," shouted Bob Steele, pointing at Peter. "All right, be quiet all of you," said the sergeant. "You can all talk to the inspector when he comes." The sergeant took Bob Steele and Tommy Logan and put them in one room. Then he opened another door and put Peter into a different room. "Peter!" shouted a voice. Peter looked up. It was John. "Peter, how good to see you. Is everything all right now?" asked John. "Are they going to let me go?" "No," said Peter sadly. "Then what are you doing here?" asked John. "I'm under arrest too," said Peter. What for? John asked in surprise. Dangerous driving, replied Peter. He told John the whole story, and John listened without saying anything. Then John told Peter that the police had asked him lots of questions, but that he hadn't told them anything. I think it's about time you did tell us everything, said a voice from behind them. It was Inspector Shaw. Now, said Inspector Shaw, you are both in bad trouble. I want the truth. Inspector Shaw sat down. He looked at Peter and John. I want the truth, the inspector said again, seriously. Peter looked serious too. He was going to tell the inspector the whole story. He hoped Inspector Shaw would believe him. If the inspector didn't believe his story, Peter knew that he would be sent to prison for helping John and for driving dangerously. Inspector Shaw listened without saying anything, while Peter told him the whole story from the moment he had given John a lift to the chase through Bristol. The inspector wrote some notes in a little book while Peter was talking. Do you expect me to believe this story? Asked Inspector Shaw when Peter had finished. Yes, said Peter. It's the truth, John added. We'll see, replied the inspector as he left the room. Inspector Shaw returned a minute later with Sergeant Blake, with Bob Steele and Tommy Logan. Sergeant Blake brought in some chairs and they all sat down. Inspector Shaw turned to Bob Steele, who looked very frightened. You've been in trouble before, said the inspector, and this time you will go to prison unless you tell us all about that you know. Prison? Said Bob Steele. I haven't done anything. I haven't killed anyone. I was just walking past Mr. Stevens' house the night before last when I saw... Be quiet, you old fool, shouted Tommy Logan as he jumped to his feet. Sergeant Blake pushed Tommy back into his chair. What did you see? Inspector Shaw asked Bob Steele. Bob Steele continued, I saw a young man running out of the house. He left the front door open. I was surprised, so I went in to have a look. Mr. Stevens was lying on the floor. Who was the boy you saw running out of the house? Asked the inspector. Bob Steele pointed at John. It was him, he said. I didn't, started John. Be quiet, said Sergeant Blake. What happened next? The inspector asked Bob Steele. Well, Bob Steele continued, Mr. Stevens was lying on the floor. I could see that he wasn't dead because he was breathing. Just then I heard footsteps coming, so I ran out of the back door and hid in the garden. I could hear a loud argument and then a fight. I went around to the front of the house and looked in the window, but I couldn't see anything. I waited, and after a few minutes, I saw a young man leaving the house. Was it the same boy as before? Inspector Shaw asked. Bob Steele looked at Tommy Logan. No, he said. It was Tommy Logan. You're a liar, said Tommy Logan. That's not true. What did you do then? Asked the inspector. I went into the house again, replied Bob Steele, but when I saw that Mr. Stevens was dead, I left. I telephoned the police and then went home. That's not true, shouted Tommy Logan. That's not true. Bob Steele followed me and then asked me for money. He said if I didn't give him £100, he would tell the police he had seen me at Mr. Stevens' house. So you were at Mr. Stevens' house, the inspector said quickly. Yes, that's all right. That's right. I was there, replied Tommy Logan. He looked angry. At the same time, he looked as if he was going to cry. Bob Steele kept on asking for more money, said Tommy Logan. I gave him some more money, but it was no use. You've caught me anyway. Tommy Logan stopped talking and started to cry. Stop crying, said Inspector Shaw to Tommy roughly, and tell us what happened when you went to Mr. Stevens' house. I didn't mean to, started Tommy Logan. I didn't mean to. Come on, said Inspector Shaw in more gentle voice. Tell me what happened. Tommy Logan looked around at the others. I went to see Mr. Stevens, Tommy continued, because he had given me a lot of extra work to do. He had given me some extra homework because he thought I had been rude to him in class. I did the work at home and then took it around to Mr. Stevens' house. I wanted to explain to him that I thought he was being unfair to me. When I got to the house, the front door was open. I knocked, but there was no answer. I went into the room and I saw Mr. Stevens. Mr. Stevens lying on the floor. I thought he was ill, so I started to lift him up. What did Mr. Stevens do? Asked the inspector. Mr. Stevens opened his eyes and looked at me. Then he pushed me away and stood up. I gave him the work that I had done. Mr. Stevens looked at it for a minute and then threw it on the floor. He said it was all wrong. He hit me hard on the face and said that he was going to teach me a lesson. I told Mr. Stevens that he didn't have any right to hit me. He just laughed. I tried to leave, but he stopped me. Then he took off his coat and said he was going to beat me. I pushed him away and ran for the door, but Mr. Stevens got there first and pushed me back. Tommy Logan stopped talking and looked quickly at the inspector. And what happened next? The inspector asked. Mr. Stevens started hitting me on the head and on the body. Tommy Logan continued. He was hitting me hard, so I became angry and picked up a chair to push him away. Mr. Stevens caught hold of the chair and it broke. One of the legs fell on the floor, so I picked up the chair leg instead. Mr. Stevens laughed and said I could hurt him however hard I tried. He hit me again. Come on, he said, hit me. Are you frightened to hit me? Then Mr. Stevens came closer and hit me in the face again. I hit him with the chair leg. He stopped and picked up another chair leg. Then he shouted that he was going to kill me. He ran towards me holding the chair leg. As he came closer, I hit him with all my strength and he fell to the floor. Tommy Logan stopped speaking and there was a short silence. Then he looked at the inspector and at John. I didn't mean to do it, he said. I didn't mean to do it. Well, that's the end of the story, listeners. I hope you have enjoyed the Bristol murder. Thank you very much.